There is a version of you that other people know very well. They know how you answer when someone asks how you are doing. They know the tone you use at work, the face you put on at family dinners, the way you hold yourself when you are being watched. They know the version of you that shows up on time, says the right things, manages the right impressions, and leaves the room without having revealed anything that might complicate their image of you. And that version of you is functional. It is even necessary. It has gotten you through rooms you needed to get through. It has protected you in situations where being unprotected was not an option. It has earned you things: stability, approval, access, belonging, that the raw, unfiltered version of yourself might never have been offered. But there is something that version of you cannot do. It cannot rest. Because the mask, and that is what it is, however well crafted, however perfectly fitted to the contours of your actual face, requires maintenance. Constant, exhausting, invisible maintenance. Every interaction where you perform rather than simply are. Every conversation where you monitor yourself, where you choose what to reveal, what to conceal, what to emphasize, what to soften, costs something. Something you cannot name precisely, but you feel at the end of the day. That specific tiredness that is not physical. That heaviness that comes not from having done too much, but from having performed too consistently. From having been, all day long, the version of yourself that other people needed you to be, rather than the version that actually exists when no one is watching. Carl Jung had a name for this mask. He called it the persona. And he spent decades studying what happens to people who wear it too well, who wear it so consistently for so long that they begin to forget there was ever a face beneath it, who mistake the mask for the self, who organize their entire identity around the performance and then wake up one day to a life that is technically successful, technically stable, technically everything it was supposed to be, and completely, quietly unrecognizable. This video is for those people. It may be for you. Not because you are performing in some dramatic or dishonest way, but because somewhere along the line, gradually, reasonably, understandably, you began to prioritize the image over the interior. And the interior has been paying the price ever since. Stay with me. Let me describe a day, and I want you to notice how much of it you recognize. You wake up, and before you have fully oriented yourself to consciousness, you are already scanning, already preparing, already constructing the version of yourself that the day is going to require. At work, you are competent, you are measured, you present your ideas in the tone that will be received rather than the tone in which you actually feel them. You absorb criticism in the way that will be perceived as professionalism, even when what you actually feel is something rawer, something more honest. In social settings, you modulate. You read the room instinctively, automatically, with a precision you have never had to consciously develop, and you adjust accordingly. You are warmer here, more reserved there, funnier in this group, more serious in that one. You give people the version of you they seem most comfortable receiving. And you are good at it, genuinely good. People like you, they respect you, they find you easy to be around, a pleasant, reliable, professionally competent, socially aware, and then you come home, and you close the door. And in the silence, in the absence of the performance, you feel something you cannot quite name. Not sadness exactly, not unhappiness, something quieter and more persistent. Something like the feeling of having been somewhere very loud for a very long time and finally being in a space where it is quiet. Except the quiet does not feel peaceful. It feels empty because the thing that has been filling the space, the performance, the mask, the carefully maintained image is gone, and what it was covering is still there. Waiting, unattended, increasingly difficult to recognize. Jung wrote something about this that I want you to sit with. The persona is a compromise between the individual and society as to what a man should appear to be. A compromise, not a lie necessarily, not a performance in the theatrical sense, but a negotiation, an ongoing, automatic negotiation between who you actually are and what the world around you has agreed to reward. And the longer that negotiation has been running, the more practiced and automatic it has become, the more you have drifted from one side of it, the side that is not a compromise, the side that was never negotiated, the side that is simply, quietly, persistently you. Here is what the performance is costing you, not in ways that are immediately visible, not in the dramatic way that breakdowns and crises and obvious unravelings are visible, but in the slow, cumulative, almost imperceptible way that all invisible costs accumulate. You have lost access to your own reactions, not entirely, not always, but there are moments, more of them than you would like to admit, where you genuinely do not know what you feel, where someone asks you what you want and the question opens onto something that should have an obvious answer and instead opens onto a kind of blankness. Because the practice of filtering your reactions for public consumption, the practice of translating what you actually feel into what is appropriate to express, has become so automatic that the original feeling is sometimes gone before you have a chance to register it. You feel something, you run it through the filter, and by the time it emerges, it is no longer quite the feeling you started with. It is the version of the feeling that is safe to have. You have become a stranger to your own preferences. Not in the small, mundane sense. You know what you like to eat, what films interest you, what music you return to when you need to feel something. But in the deeper sense, in the sense of what do I actually want my life to look like? What do I actually believe when I am not performing belief for an audience? What actually matters to me? Not what I have convinced myself matters, not what is supposed to matter to someone in my position. But actually, the radical truth is this. The persona is not a mask you put on. It is a mask that was built on top of you, layer by layer, across years of social conditioning, parental expectation, institutional reward, cultural pressure. Layer by layer, a self was constructed on top of the self that was already there. And the self underneath has not disappeared, but it has been waiting, patiently, insistently, sometimes desperately, waiting to be acknowledged, to be allowed, to be lived. And the exhaustion you feel, the specific, nameless drain of modern life, is not primarily the exhaustion of doing too much. It is the exhaustion of being perpetually someone other than who you are. Jung introduced the concept of the persona in his work on the structure of the psyche. And from the beginning, he was careful to make a distinction that most people who have heard the word miss entirely. The persona is not pathological. It is not a mistake. It is not evidence of inauthenticity. It is necessary. The word itself comes from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. The literal face placed over the face to indicate the character being played. And Jung's use of it carries that origin forward with full intention. We all play characters. We all occupy roles. We all present different faces to different contexts. Professional, personal, familial, social. This is not dishonesty. It is the fundamental requirement of social existence. The person who presents exactly the same self in a job interview as in their most intimate relationship, in a conflict as in a celebration, in grief as in joy, is not more authentic than the rest of us. They are simply less adapted. The persona is the adaptive mechanism, the interface between the inner world and the outer world. The set of behaviors, presentations, and modes of being that allow us to function across the variety of contexts that a life in society requires. It is, in Jung's formulation, a necessary and valuable piece of psychological equipment. The problem that Jung spent his career identifying and his patients spent their lives embodying, is what happens when the persona becomes more than equipment. When it becomes identity. The persona, Jung wrote, is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. That which in reality one is not, but which both the self and others take to be real. This is the crisis point, not the wearing of the mask. But the moment when the mask and the face become indistinguishable, when you can no longer tell from the inside where the performance ends and the person begins. And this happens gradually, almost imperceptibly. It begins with the reasonable adaptations of childhood. You learn what is rewarded and what is punished. You learn what makes the people around you comfortable and what makes them withdraw. You learn which of your qualities are received as gifts and which are experienced as problems. And you adjust, as all children do, because adjustment is survival. Then you carry those adjustments into adolescence, into early adulthood, into the professional world, into your adult relationships, and with each context, the persona is refined, expanded, strengthened. It works. It earns you things. It gets you through. And so you keep wearing it. Keep maintaining it. Keep investing in it as if it were the self rather than the interface. Until one day, and this day comes for most people, though not everyone recognizes it, you catch a glimpse of yourself in a metaphorical mirror. Not the mirror that reflects the persona, the other one. And what you see, what looks back at you for a moment before you look away, is someone you barely recognize. Someone who has been waiting behind the mask for a very long time. There is a specific form of psychological suffering that Jung identified which is unlike depression, unlike anxiety, unlike any of the categories that clinical psychology typically reaches for. He called it persona inflation. And it describes what happens when a person has invested so completely, so exclusively, so thoroughly in their social role, in their professional identity, their family identity, their cultural identity, that the role has consumed them. They are no longer a person who plays a role. They have become the role. The executive who cannot be vulnerable because executives are not vulnerable. The caregiver who cannot receive care because caregivers are the ones who give it. The competent one who cannot be lost because being lost is not what competent people do. The strong one who cannot ask for help because strength means not needing it. In each case, the identity has been organized so completely around the persona that the actual self, the self that gets tired, that has needs, that sometimes does not know, that sometimes cannot, that sometimes simply does not want to, has been pushed outside the frame of what is permissible. And the self that has been pushed outside does not disappear. It accumulates, it builds pressure, it seeks expression in the only channels that have not been closed off. Sometimes it appears as inexplicable sadness, a grief with no object, a heaviness that cannot be explained by circumstances. Sometimes it appears as a persistent sense of unreality, the feeling of watching your own life from a slight distance, of being present without being present, of going through motions that should feel meaningful and feeling nothing. Sometimes it appears as the sudden, overwhelming desire for disruption, to blow up something that is working, to disappear from a life that others envy, to do something entirely out of character, not because it would be good, but because it would at least be real. Jung called this the return of the repressed self, and he was clear about its inevitability. The self cannot be permanently suppressed. It can be postponed, it can be managed, it can be kept at bay through enough activity, enough achievement, enough investment in the maintenance of the mask. But it will find its way back, and the longer it has been waiting, the more disruptive its return tends to be. This is why midlife crises, in their genuine psychological form beneath the cliches, are often exactly what they look like from the outside. A sudden, apparently irrational disruption of a life that was working perfectly well. The car, the affair, the career change, the move, these are rarely about their surface content. They are attempts, however blunt and often destructive, to reconnect with a self that has been masked for too long. They are the self breaking through. And the tragedy is not that the breakthrough happens. The tragedy is that it had to be this violent, that the persona had to be shattered rather than voluntarily set aside, that a life had to be disrupted rather than a mask gradually, consciously removed. Because there is another way. A harder way in some respects, slower, less dramatic, requiring more honesty and more sustained attention. but a way that does not require everything to break before the self can breathe. Who are you when no one is watching? Not in the sense of secret behaviors or private vices, but in the deeper sense, who are you when the performance is not required? When you are not being the competent one, the reliable one, the strong one, the easygoing one, the successful one. When none of those descriptions are being confirmed or performed or maintained, what remains? For many people, sitting with that question produces not an answer, but a discomfort, a blankness, a mild panic, a sense that the question is somehow dangerous, and that discomfort is itself the data. Because who you are when no one is watching should not feel dangerous. It should not feel like absence. It should not produce blankness. If it does, if the removal of the audience produces not relief but vertigo, it means the persona has been doing more than adapting. It has been substituting. It has been filling the space where the self should be. Jung was precise about what lies beneath the persona when it is finally, genuinely set aside. Not chaos, not a void, not the emptiness that the panic suggests. What lies beneath is both more ordinary and more significant than that. It is the self that formed before the world's opinions became more important than its own. The self that had preferences before it learned which preferences were acceptable. The self that had energy before that energy was redirected into managing impressions. The self that had desires before it learned which desires were safe to want. It is, in most cases, not an exotic or dramatic self. It is simply yours. And the work, the real work, the work that the persona has been making impossible, is the work of recovering it. Not dramatically, not through the violent disruption of what has been built, but through the sustained, patient, often uncomfortable practice of paying attention to what is actually there, beneath the performance, to the reactions you habitually filter, the preferences you habitually suppress, the needs you habitually outsource, the feelings you habitually translate before they have a chance to be fully felt. Jung wrote that the process of individuation, of becoming genuinely, wholly oneself, requires what he called the dissolution of the persona. Not its elimination, not the abandonment of all social adaptation, but a loosening, a making flexible of what has become rigid, a restoration of the relationship between the mask and the face, so that the mask is worn consciously, intentionally, as a tool, rather than unconsciously, compulsively, as a substitute for having a face at all. And that dissolution, however gentle, however gradual, is one of the most disorienting experiences available to a human being. Because it requires you to discover who you are without the credentials, without the role, without the function, simply who you are. And that encounter with the self that exists prior to performance is both simpler and more profound than almost anything else you will ever undertake. Here is something that most people who have heard of the persona do not know. The persona and the shadow are not separate phenomena. They are, in Jung's framework, two sides of the same movement. Every time you build up the persona, every time you add a layer to the mask, every time you emphasize a quality for social consumption, every time you perform a version of yourself that the world rewards, the opposite movement is happening simultaneously. What is being excluded from the persona is being deposited into the shadow. The qualities that are not part of the acceptable presentation do not disappear. They go underground, into the same territory that holds the rejected aspects of the self, the unintegrated emotions, the capacities that were deemed too threatening or too inappropriate to be allowed into the mask. This is why people who have built the most polished, most elaborate personas often have the most volatile, most intense, most unexpected shadow material. The executive who is always composed, who has built a professional identity entirely around control and competence and emotional regulation, is carrying in the shadow everything that composure has required them to suppress. The rage, the fear, the need, the grief, the confusion, all the human states that do not belong in the persona of a competent executive, the caregiver who is always giving, who has organized their identity around generosity, around being there for others, around never being the one who needs, is carrying, in the shadow, an entire landscape of unmet needs, resentment, exhaustion, the barely suppressed fury of someone who has been giving from an empty cup for longer than they can remember. The easygoing person, the one who never makes things difficult, who can always find a compromise, who prides themselves on never being the source of conflict, is carrying, in the shadow, a refusal. A refusal to want things too much, to advocate too loudly, to be inconvenient, and beneath the refusal, the anger of someone who has been making themselves small for the sake of other people's comfort for as long as they can remember. The persona, in other words, casts a shadow, and the size and intensity of the shadow is proportional to the size and rigidity of the mask. This is why Jung was so insistent that the work of the persona could not be done in isolation from the work of the shadow. That attempting to refine the mask, to become a better, more authentic version of your public self, without simultaneously attending to what the mask has displaced, is not integration. It is just a more sophisticated form of the same problem. Because the shadow does not become less influential simply because the persona becomes more polished. It becomes more powerful, more autonomous, more likely to erupt in the moments when the persona's control is at its weakest, in intimacy, in stress, in the unguarded moments of genuine human encounter. This is why the people who seem the most controlled, the most composed, the most impressive in their self-presentation are often the most surprising when they finally crack. When the persona finally gives way and what has been accumulating in the shadow finally finds the opening it has been looking for. The work, then, is not simply to loosen the mask. It is to attend to what the mask has been holding in place. To ask, what have I been keeping out of my image of myself? What qualities have I decided are not part of who I am? And where are those qualities going? Because they are going somewhere. They always do. Let me be clear about something that is easy to misunderstand. The goal of this work is not to remove the persona entirely. That is neither possible nor desirable. We are social creatures. We inhabit roles. We present different faces to different contexts. This is not a failure of authenticity. It is a feature of human existence. The goal, the thing that changes everything, is not the absence of the mask. It is the knowledge that you are wearing one. Jung made this distinction with great care because he understood that the pathology is not in the adaptation. It is in the identification. It is not wearing the persona that damages us. It is believing that we are the persona. It is organizing our entire sense of self around a social construction that was always, in its nature, partial. When you wear the mask consciously, when you can say in any given moment, this is the face I am presenting for this context, and I know it is a face, something fundamental changes. The mask no longer defines you. You define the mask. You can put it on and take it off. You can adapt your presentation without losing your interior. You can be professional without being only professional. You can be competent without being only competent. You can be the reliable one without the weight of being nothing but reliable. And this absolutely requires that there is somewhere to return to. Something underneath the mask that is real, that is inhabited, that is lived. Not perfectly, not completely, not without residue of the conditioning that built the mask in the first place, but genuinely enough that you know the difference, that you can feel the difference between the moments when you are being the mask, consciously, appropriately, as a tool for navigating a world that requires adaptation, and the moments when you are simply quietly, without performance or management, yourself. And to know the difference, you have to have encountered the self that exists beneath the performance. You have to have sat with it long enough to recognize its particular quality, its particular texture, the way it feels to be tired, and let yourself actually be tired. Not managed tired, not stoic tired, not productive, even in exhaustion, tired, but simply tired. The way it feels to want something and let the wanting be fully real, not edited for palatability, not immediately translated into what is reasonable to want, but wanted. Fully, honestly, without apology. The way it feels to not know, and to let the not knowing be present, without immediately filling it with the performance of competence. These are small things. They do not look like breakthroughs. They will not feel dramatic, but they are the practice of inhabiting yourself, of returning again and again to the face beneath the mask. And every return makes the next one a little easier. And every moment of genuine self-inhabitation makes the mask a little less necessary, a little more optional, and the life beneath it a little more real. The question is always practical, eventually. Not what does this mean, but what do I do? Not in some grand, life-overhauling sense. But today, in the ordinary texture of a life that is running on persona, in ways that may be more thorough than you realized. The first practice is the one Jung considered foundational to all inner work. Solitude, real solitude, not the solitude of scrolling alone, not the solitude of being in a room by yourself while performing for an imagined audience, but the solitude of genuine interior quiet, where there is no one to be anything for, even 10 minutes a day, even 5 minutes of genuine interiority, where you are not monitoring yourself, not preparing yourself for the next performance, not processing the last one, can begin to create a relationship with the self that the persona has been obscuring. Because in genuine solitude, the persona relaxes. There is no role to maintain, no impression to manage, no version of yourself to project and sustain. And in that relaxation, what has been underneath begins to surface. Not always comfortably. Sometimes the first experience of genuine solitude for someone who has been running on persona for years is anxiety. The absence of the performance feels like exposure. The quiet feels threatening. The self that begins to surface feels unfamiliar. This is normal. It is the beginning of the encounter, not a sign that something is wrong. The second practice is noticing the drain in real time. Begin to pay attention to the specific interactions, contexts, and relationships that leave you feeling most depleted. Not the interactions that are difficult because they involve genuine challenge or conflict. Those are draining in a different way. The interactions that leave you feeling hollow, empty in a specific way. The way you feel after you have performed extensively without once being real. Those interactions are diagnostic. They are showing you exactly where the persona is working hardest, where the mask is most elaborate, where the gap between the presented self and the actual self is most pronounced. And once you can see that gap clearly, once you can name the interactions where you are most thoroughly performing, you have the information you need to begin asking, what would it mean to be slightly more real in this context? Not radically, not recklessly. You do not owe anyone your interiority, but slightly more, in the direction of honesty, in the direction of presence, in the direction of a version of yourself that does not cost so much to maintain. The third practice, and this is the most demanding and the most important, is the practice of chosen vulnerability. Not oversharing, not abandoning appropriate social boundaries, but deliberately, in contexts that are safe enough to hold it, choosing to be slightly more honest than the persona would prefer. To say, actually, I am finding this difficult, when the persona would say, I'm fine. To say, I don't know, when the persona would perform certainty. To say, I need something, when the persona would manage without asking. These are small violations of the persona's requirements. And each moment where you choose the real response over the managed one, weakens the identification just slightly. Not enough to notice dramatically, but enough to build, over time, a different relationship between the mask and the face. A relationship in which the face is primary, in which the mask is worn consciously by someone who knows they are wearing it, in which the performance is occasional and appropriate rather than total and exhausting, in which you can come home at the end of the day, close the door, and not feel empty. Because there is someone there, someone real and inhabited, and yours. Someone who was always there, beneath the mask, waiting, with remarkable patience, to be finally allowed to exist. Jung wrote something near the end of his career that I want to leave with you. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who you were told to be, not who you have been rewarded for being, not the role you have played so consistently that both you and others have long since stopped distinguishing it from the person, who you truly are. And the word he used was privilege, not obligation, not imperative, not the stern vocabulary of self-improvement and its implicit threats. Privilege. The thing that is not guaranteed, the thing that must be chosen, the thing that most people, however long they live, however much they accomplish, never quite manage to claim. Because claiming it requires something uncomfortable. It requires the willingness to disappoint people who have grown accustomed to the persona you have been providing. The colleagues who need you to be always competent, the family members who need you to be always fine, the friends who need you to be always easygoing, always available, always the version of yourself that asks least of the relationship. It requires the willingness to be, for a period, less legible, less predictable, less reliably the thing that people have been relying on you to be. And it requires something even more difficult than disappointing others. It requires tolerating your own discomfort at being real. Because the self beneath the persona, the one that has been waiting, is not a polished self. It is not a managed self. It is a self that does not always know, does not always have it together, does not always perform at the level the persona has established as the baseline. It is a self that is sometimes tired and shows it, that sometimes needs and admits it, that sometimes feels things it cannot explain and does not pretend otherwise. That is a more difficult self to inhabit than the persona, in the short term, in the immediate social calculus. But it is the only self that can actually be lived. The persona can be maintained. It cannot be lived. It can be performed indefinitely at great cost. But the life behind it, the actual, interior, unrepeatable life, can only happen in the moments when the performance pauses. And those moments, those cracks in the mask, those unguarded intervals where the real self briefly surfaces, are not failures of the persona. They are invitations. Every moment of genuine tiredness that you allow to be real. Every moment of honest confusion that you permit without performing certainty. Every moment of wanting something and letting the want be fully present. These are not weaknesses. They are the self insisting on existing. Before you leave, I want to ask you something. Think about the version of yourself that other people know best, the one you have maintained most consistently across the most contexts. And then ask yourself, when was the last time that version took a rest? When was the last time you were in a situation, any situation, where you were not in some way performing it? Because the answer to that question will tell you something important, not just about how tired you are, but about how far you have traveled from the face that was always underneath, and whether it might be time, quietly, without drama, without destroying anything, to begin the journey back. The next video continues this journey into the territory of what lives beneath the persona, into the shadow that the mask creates, and what becomes possible when both are finally seen. That is where we go next. See you there.